In the dim light of a rain-soaked graveyard, a woman vowed for revenge at her sister's grave. Tears streamed down her face, her voice a whisper of pain and determination. In a dark mansion, where grief now surrounded her, a call came in from her mother, crying bitterly about her lost child. "Hope, you're all I've got now. Please be safe till I come." But consumed by revenge, Hope promised her mother, saying, "I'll make sure they all pay for this." Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. An old lady's desperate voice pleaded for her son's promised money for treatment. But consumed by pain and a thirst for revenge, Hope responded, "What do I get in return?" The old lady's voice quivered. "Anything, please, just help him." "Anything?" Hope asked, as she let out an evil laugh that resonated through the hallways of the mansion. And thus began a dark journey of vengeance. Sisters on Fire Part 4. That morning, Hope arrived at the mansion to see Mrs. Davis, her mom's closest friend. She saw Edward and Ella, who had just returned from the hospital and were injured. Hope cried bitterly, blaming Edward and Ella for her sister's demise. Perhaps if Edward had returned Agnes' love, everything would have been better. But Edward just stood there, guilty and unable to blame Hope. They all cried, including Mrs. Davis, mourning Agnes. Mrs. Davis soon offered Hope a room in the mansion. Just as Hope refused, Ella said, "I know your pain, and I feel it too. I once lost my sister like you did, and the pain was unbearable. You can't stay alone and suffer alone. Please accept our offer." Hope agreed, but insisted on staying in her late sister's room. The next morning, Mrs. Davis lost consciousness in the sitting room while they were all talking and was rushed to the hospital. She was treated and soon returned home. That evening, a nurse from the hospital, Debbie, came by to give her some medications and said she was sent from the hospital, which they confirmed as true. Debbie had to stay with Mrs. Davis to be a personal nurse in case this happened again. Days passed and things seemed to be going well, except for the fact that Hope still hated Ella and they often argued. Edward had also probably proposed to Ella and they were now officially dating. Ella glowed beautifully in the mansion. But soon, the same thing happened to Mrs. Davis again. But luckily for them, Nurse Debbie was good at her job. Edward, on the other hand, seemed to be getting along with Hope, unlike with Agnes, which upset Ella so much. She barely had time to spend with Edward because he was at work. By the time he returned, she was always asleep. Although they talked and called each other, whenever she saw Hope with Edward, she got really jealous and retreated to her room. Nurse Debbie, who had been observing things in the house, decided to step in for Ella. One afternoon, while Ella was sitting alone in the sitting room, Debbie approached her and struck up a conversation to keep her from being bored. They vibed that afternoon and a bond grew between them. Ella confided in Debbie about her troubles and Debbie advised her. "Men are like buses. Wait too long and you'll lose your seat to someone who just stepped in. You say that girl fine, Abi? You must stand up for your rights." After a long conversation, Ella gained confidence. She confronted Hope, telling her to stay away from her boyfriend and that she was overstepping. Hope replied, "Until he puts a ring in your finger, he is not yours to keep." Upset, Ella confided in Nurse Debbie, who encouraged her, and soon Ella found peace with this nurse. They took each other as sisters. But Mrs. Davis' health continued to fluctuate. One evening, Ella caught Hope in the kitchen putting something in Mrs. Davis' food. When she approached her, Hope shoved her off, saying she was just adding more salt because the food was bland. They got into an heated argument and Ella told Nurse Debbie, who said she would confront Hope because Mrs. Davis was a patient and she couldn't be working in vain. However, when Ella told Edward that evening, Edward said Hope had already explained what happened and urged Ella to calm down. Cornering her and threatening her isn't necessary. "You know I love you and that's it. She just lost her sister. Let's be easy on her, please." Ella got upset after hearing this from Edward and she fought with him. Soon stopping to talk to him, the nurse encouraged her, saying Edward would soon miss her and cherish her more. One afternoon, Ella overheard Nurse Debbie confronting Hope about touching Mrs. Davis' food and threatening to report her if anything bad happened again. Ella felt relieved that at least the nurse believed her when no one else did. But one night, missing Edward too much to ignore him, Ella went to talk to him, crying. Edward also confessed he missed her, but questioned why she suddenly changed and stopped talking to him. Ella explained everything, her feelings, her jealousy, and how the nurse had been advising her to be strong. Oh, so a nurse you don't even know is making you act up and ruin our relationship, Edward said. But they soon kissed and made up. From that night, Edward began to consider what Ella said about Hope and grew suspicious about the nurse. The next day, Ella overheard Hope talking on the phone in her room, saying they were finally going to execute the plan to kill Ella that night, making it look like an accident. Ella, terrified, told the nurse since Edward wasn't around. The nurse also got scared for Ella and they made a plan to sneak Ella out that evening and insert CCTV cameras in her room. Don't tell anyone this. We don't know who is behind this. We can't trust anyone right now, the nurse advised. That evening, they fled the mansion and the nurse drove Ella to a safe place. Meanwhile, Edward researched the nurse online but found nothing about her. He stumbled upon Agnes' post on Facebook, seeing a picture with her and her sister captioned, "My sister came to me like an angel." To his shock, he realized the nurse in the picture was Hope, not the person pretending to be her. Edward was confused and dug deeper, finding news articles about Agnes' sister and the fire incident. He soon discovered the nurse was his long-lost lover, the love of his life he had mourned for years, thinking she was dead. Edward was shocked and could not breathe properly. Edward almost fainted, feeling scared and cold. He rushed to Ella's room but found it empty. Panicking, he checked his mom's room only to find it deserted as well. The imposter, Hope, the nurse who was actually Anna, and even some of the maids were missing. Edward could barely breathe as he began to make frantic calls. As the phone rang countless times, it was in the hands of a woman. Ella, tied up helplessly, confused as to why the nurse had betrayed her, could only hear the nurse reveal herself as Hope, Agnes' sister, as an evil laugh echoed through the room. In a test for a friend she could confide in, Ella's own trust led her to her doom. Let's find out what happened next in part 5. Like, follow, and comment next for part 5.